Hi, I'm Judy Cole, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this web production of the MIT Alumni Association.
Hey everybody, I'm Roush. Welcome to the MIT Faculty Forum Online Edition. I'm Outreach Officer for the MIT Program in Science, Technology, and Society and a fellow MIT alum. And this is an interactive forum, so once I introduce our guests, I'm going to encourage you to submit your questions, and that'll help drive the conversation. You can just do that by just completing the Google form that's right underneath this live streaming window, and that'll send me a question that I'll see right on my computer, and I will get to as many of your questions as I can in the time allotted. So joining us today are fellow MIT alums from Cornell University, Purdue University, and the American University in Beirut. I'll let them introduce themselves, but we might describe our agenda today as a recap of the year in nuclear energy, so to speak. So, of course, much has been made of the historic, potentially historic, Comprehensive Plan of Action signed in Vienna this summer that lays out a framework for nuclear development and non-proliferation in Iran. And if you missed the headlines about MIT's involvement, the lead scientist for Iran was Ali Salehi, PhD 77, who worked out a lot of the fine print of Iran's plans alongside former faculty member on the other side of the table and honorary alum Ernest Moniz from the U.S. Department of Energy. But perhaps even more historic was how nuclear energy fared in the Paris climate talks these past few weeks. And of course, the historic pact that nations signed on Saturday commits nations to large greenhouse gas reductions, which many argue can only be accomplished through the increased use of nuclear power. So we'll be talking about all of those issues today. And I'm going to bring in our alumni now to ask them to tell us a little bit about their own research and how it applies to these and other topics, and then we'll take questions from you. So our alumni today, who we've rounded up to talk with us, include Waleed Hazbun, who is a 2002 PhD from MIT and is now Associate Professor in Political Studies at the American University in Beirut. We also have joining us Martín Bertodano, 83, and master's degree, also 83. He's now Associate Professor at the Purdue University School of Nuclear Engineering. And finally, we have John Mathiason, who's a 1968 PhD, who was a lecturer in Cornell University's Institute for Public Affairs. So, gentlemen, I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves, talk a little more about what you're up to these days and how it relates back to your days at MIT, and feel free to weigh in as you introduce yourselves about the sort of, in many ways, historic events that are changing the context and perhaps even the future for nuclear power and nuclear strategy in the Middle East and elsewhere. So why don't we start with Waleed Hazbun at American University in Beirut.
Hi, it's nice to be with you. I work in the fields of international political economy and international relations with a focus on the region of the Middle East and a special interest in the role of the United States in the region. And my recent, let's say, research, in particular since I came to AUB in 2010, is focused on changes in regional geopolitics at this moment I've called sort of towards the end of the American era in the region. You know, in the 1990s, the U.S. had a lot of influence in the region after the Gulf War, when there was an outbreak of the peace process, the Arab-Israeli peace process, and so throughout that era, the U.S. had a strong role to play. But this process, this period broke down around 2000, in part, also the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq led to kind of the state collapse and erosion in Iraq, and really opened the door for expanded Iranian influence in Iraq, but also throughout the region with its allies in Palestine, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and also its alliance with Syria. It also, around 2010, the U.S. was planning to withdraw its large land-based ground forces from the region. So it's kind of looking at this period. I'm interested in what we call the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is let's say plays a critical role in these issues about energy and security. But I'm also been interested in sort of the increasing role of non-state actors, how because of the declining forms of governance, economic challenges. There's been erosion of state powers. And sort of a fragmentation of territorial control, the rise of non-state actors. So across the region, a lot of this was added to by the Arab uprisings and the consequences. So between Libya, Yemen, Palestine, now Syria and Iraq, you have this kind of great political fragmentation. So often central state authorities have less power to direct change. And so this kind of ties back to the regional politics of the Iran deal, where you can note that in part one of the American motivations for this deal was to be able to disengage militarily from the region, but with a sense that Iran's that there wouldn't be any sort of challengers with nuclear weapons. But at the same time, we've also had this struggle with Iran seeking to expand its regional influence, which I think has played into regional power struggles between Iran and its rivals, the U.S. allies, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. So it's around that axis that I look at this from the geopolitical aspects, and we can get into the consequences specifically of the Iran deal later.
Okay, great. That's a terrific introduction. And why don't we move on now to Bertodano at Purdue University. Martin, can you tell us a little bit about what you're up to right now? All right, we might have lost Martin. I'm going to skip to John Mathiason, and we'll come back to Martin. John, what are you up to now at Cornell? And tell us about, of course, your work for various international regulatory agencies as well.
Well, thank you. I'm one of the MIT people who decided not to go into theory but into practice. So when I finished, I spent 30 years in the United Nations Secretariat. My work at Cornell has to do with the training of master's students in how to manage the international public sector. And a lot of what I've been doing since I left the United Nations is dealing with organizations that will have an increasing role in managing issues like climate change and issues like verification of the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. So I've done a lot of work with the International Atomic Energy Agency since I retired, including doing some evaluations of how they perform their work and doing training in management of the IAEA. In addition to that, I also do some research, and I'm working on a book on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an important organization that whose importance will probably grow even more after the Paris Agreement. So I'm looking forward to this discussion because, of course, nuclear energy and the IAEA are major players in all of this.
They certainly are, and we'll come back to those issues as we get into the discussion. I think we've got Martin back now. Martin, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you got me for a little while only, but...
Yeah, no, that's okay. Why don't you dive in and tell us about your work in the School of Nuclear Engineering there at Purdue?
Well, my work is on nuclear reactor safety, and in particular, I work on the two-fluid model, which is something I picked up at MIT, and I've been doing research on that for the rest of my life. The model is used in nuclear reactor safety codes to determine the licensing of nuclear reactors. It's a very advanced model, and it is still not fully understood. It's got stability issues and so forth. I've done some CFD work and also research on turbulence.
Martin, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by the two-fluid model, and how does that relate to the safety of liquid-cooled nuclear reactors?
Well, nuclear reactors are, at the end of the day, just a boiler, and you are working with water and steam, and so you have to average the fluid dynamics equations for water and steam mixtures. So anybody that studied fluid dynamics, this is a little more complicated than the single-phase Navier-Stokes equations because you have all the interfacial structure that you have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, what's kind of interesting and a little horrifying to me is that when you build a nuclear plant, you aren't really just worrying about radioactive decay, fission, and those processes. You also have to basically create a virtually foolproof system of boilers and pipes and circulation and pumps. And more often than not, when you hear about an accident, it's the result of a pump failing or the coolant system breaking down. And I think we might have lost Martine, so I'm not sure I'm going to get a chance to pose my question. But I think what he was getting at was that there are all sorts of ways in which we could get better at understanding the physics of what's going on inside the coolant systems of reactors. And that's the kind of what he means by the two-fluid problem. And there are a lot of people right here at MIT still working on that as well. And I think what we hoped to do today was to try and kind of, in light of everything that's gone on this year, both in the world of climate change, understanding and responding to climate change, and in the world of nuclear non-proliferation, we were going to try and do this ambitious thing of wrapping those subjects together and get the three of you to talk a little bit about what direction we're going in with maybe a special focus on the Middle East. So perhaps, Waleed, we could jump back to you, and I'm wondering whether you feel like the deal with Iran will have a net sort of stabilizing effect or a destabilizing effect in the Middle East, and then maybe you could relate that a little later on to the prospects for nuclear energy in Iran, right? Because now that Iran is sort of under the agreement being forced to scale back on its production of highly enriched uranium, they're going to be making low enriched uranium, which presumably they'll want to use for civilian nuclear power. So all of these things are sort of wrapped up in a big ball, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean they're connected, and you could say, there's a lot. The Iran deal in many ways was one moment within these larger processes. So I think you could say overall it helped avoid, let's say, the worst possible conflicts. So that I don't think that really adds stability, but it sort of safeguards against nuclear weapons proliferation. It addresses some issues that were in the idea that Israel might unilaterally use military force to address the program that they were feared of. But in itself, that the deal doesn't address most of the other geopolitical issues that are pressing. I mean, I mentioned the issue about state erosion across the region, but also as part of the deal and as part of this process of the U.S. moving its direct military force out of the region, it's also led to basically backing its Arab allies like Saudi Arabia and UAE in a more sort of aggressive military posture, being more involved across the region, from Libya and also this bombing campaign in Yemen, which it's not clear that that's brought sort of stability in either of those places. So I think the deal in itself is not to blame for these trends. The deal was solving a narrow set of issues in the broader picture that the U.S. might have been concerned about. But it's more of these regional issues that I think haven't been addressed or not being addressed. There's some who would argue that because many of the Arab allies were opposed the deal or said they opposed the deal and were worried about expanding Iranian influence, the U.S. has been more tolerant of giving them autonomy in creating a larger regional role, which hasn't brought, let's say, stability, and we've had continuing, let's say, security challenges across the region.
So do you feel like the agreement imposes any new challenges or requirements on the international system? What do we need to be thinking about now? What structures do we need to put in place to make sure that the agreement creates a truly productive environment and doesn't degenerate into new kinds of power dynamics that might be equally scary?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the idea of having these two countries that have barely talked for decades use the idea of negotiations to solve one of their problems is a good sign for international governance. The idea that infrastructure has been put in place with the IAEA, with the the Group of 5+1. So these kind of mechanisms, I think, are very positive, that there can be negotiated solutions to these kinds of issues. And I think there's good sense that the terms of the agreement for this, let's say, the 10 to 15 years phase, let's say, we're likely to hold. So I think that is a useful operation. There's going to be a sort of a permanent level of a kind of inspections and monitoring of Iran. So I think as it relates to that issue, the international community that worked on this deal, I think, has done their job. But I think it's the other issues that are, let's say, the more conventional weapons and the more regional politics that, are where the problem is. And one question is, to what degree is this a pressing issue for the United States? And you've seen the U.S. wanted to sort of wrap things up in some ways in the region and back its allies. There's been large weapons deals with U.S. allies in the last couple of years. But at the same time, with the rise of the Islamic State, which I think is, again, the final consequence of the state erosion across Iraq and Syria, the U.S. is slowly getting more and more involved. And this process of this campaign against the Islamic State, I think, is not going to be a quick one. It's going to, the U.S. is going to be increasingly engaged. And then the next question is, who's going to fight the ground war? So now we're getting to a bunch of different issues about the Kurdish militias, Syria, the role of Turkey, and all these issues are really sort of, it's like conventional issues relating to control over territory and conflict, which is a very different set of issues, I think, than the nuclear issues that take place at a broader regional and global level. So there might be some degree of security at the global level in terms of nuclear geopolitics, but I think it's at the ground level where the instability and insecurity is proliferating.
Yeah. Let's pull it back from that huge morass of issues, maybe just to the Iran agreement, the nuclear deal. So, John Mathiason, I'm curious how well you think institutions like the IAEA, with which you've had a lot of experience, how well are they set up to actually monitor compliance with the agreement? And do you think that the deal as structured creates enough of a foundation for international organizations to do a good job there?
Well, the first thing is that the IAEA has a remarkable record of being able to detect violations of the Safeguards Agreement. Everyone who is a party to the Safeguards Agreement, the Non-Proliferation Agreement, is supposed to basically allow the IAEA to inspect based on declarations. And this worked pretty well for a long time. There was a small problem in 1991 because it turns out that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had actually developed an undeclared program, and the IAEA formally had not detected it. Now, I interviewed a lot of people who were there at the time, and they said, yeah, well, we kind of knew it was happening, but the rules weren't such that we could do this. And afterwards, based on a lot of negotiation, they created something called enhanced safeguards, which solved most of the problems. In other words, you've got a declared program, but the IAEA can go look anywhere. And another factor that was really important was to put in remote sensing devices. Nuclear, unlike a lot of other weapon systems, has an awkward thing that they give off radiation and they can be detected. And so there's a new system called enhanced safeguards that the agency is doing. That's what is the main immediate consequence methodologically of the Iran agreement, that Iran basically is going to say, okay, well, we're going to do enhanced safeguards. Now, the interesting thing is they could have done that 10 years ago, but there were the political problems that Waleed mentioned at the time. But now they're there. The probability of being able to have a weapons program is next to impossible. The IAEA is very good at this. They have people who are trained to do inspections. They have a very good job with remote sensing. They have protocols to look at. And frankly, the IAEA is one of the best managed of the U.S. UN international organizations. They know how to do their job. And I think as far as that goes, there's little probability of a nuclear program being developed for weapons. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that this is actually connected to other issues. The question is, well, why did Iran, which has tons and tons of oil, need a nuclear power, a nuclear energy program for which they would need uranium, for example? And the answer was, well, you have two things you can do with oil. You can sell it or you can burn it. And the idea was, for many people in Iran, well, better we should sell it than burn it, and we'll replace it as an energy source with nuclear. That's an issue, I suspect, that will affect other countries in the Middle East, because it's very heavily dependent in many countries on oil. And that's one of the things that's going to be affected by the Paris Agreement. So there is a linkage there of sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one would hope. So, Waleed, I'm curious, was there any sort of native interest, native enthusiasm for nuclear energy in Iran? There is at least one operating civilian nuclear power plant in Iran, and they're building more on the same site with help from Russia. At least that's my understanding. So, to what extent do the two of you think that nuclear could actually start supplying a significant chunk of Iran's energy, and would they eventually even become a potential model for the region in terms of the necessary and inevitable shift away from fossil fuels?
Mm-hmm.
Waleed, what do you think?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think, you know, the issue, it is a tricky question, because I think a large degree of the motivation really related to, let's say, you know, symbolic political issues, internal political struggles, and this idea of kind of this geopolitical presence in the world. Having, I mean, Iran, let's say, in contrast to some of the other states, really seems to have let's say, a well-developed intellectual and scientific, you know, system, in the sense that they do have this kind of knowledge. They want to develop it, show that they're a you know, modern state that has this capability. You know, strategically, their power has expanded regionally, not by being able to threaten having nuclear weapons, but by all these other mechanisms in terms of their ties to non-state actors and you know, supporting groups like Hezbollah and so forth. So I think the nuclear weapons program really related to its relationship to the United States, to this idea of what does it have to bargain to get this kind of stronger legitimacy regionally. And I think in some ways that developing the threat of such a program became something that it could use. So I think that had a very useful geopolitical tool. I mean, after all these years, this is what the United States was interested in negotiating. It hasn't been interested in negotiating other issues, but this is one issue that it has. But also Iran and the other, you know, Gulf states, they do have a lot of oil resources, but they also have large population. I mean, Iran has a large population. The other ones also have growing energy needs, and they're using up more and more of their oil. So there's other issues in terms of their energy system, in terms of the efficiencies and, you know, new technologies and investment that they could go into. So, you know, the calculations, does nuclear energy make sense? I think it becomes a tricky thing to do, and there's not always good, transparent information about exact costs and so forth. And now that you know, oil prices are lower, you know, that kind of affects the calculations. I think there's some logic to, in the sense that if you look out into the future, its growing population, its idea that if it's had constantly growing GDP, even under until the sanctions really kicked in, its economy was growing. So you could kind of see it as growing energy need. And this originally the idea that if oil prices were going to keep going up with growth of demand from China and other places, you know, the logic of switching domestic energy into you know, into nuclear, I guess, you know, made some sense. But I think it's the political and geopolitical issues that are the bigger part of the story. What you also now have is, in the last decade, or let's say less, the Arab states, Turkey, all developing their own nuclear plants. The UAE, you know, has made a deal with Korea. Saudi Arabia has plans for developing over a dozen. Even Jordan and Egypt have been talking about developing nuclear power. So, you know, it's not clear to me that this always makes, from studies I've seen, always makes the most sense financially. So I do think there's other issues going on, and I really, you know, don't think this idea of concern about greenhouse gases has been a major concern of these states.
No, and as long as they have so much oil right under the sand, right, there's going to be a huge temptation to just keep pumping it. And so under those conditions,
which they're doing, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Martine, it looks like we have you back after some technical difficulties. Are you reading me?
Yeah, I am.
All right, super. So I wanted to toss it to you and ask you a question that relates your work on reactor safety back to the larger issue of the energy transition. So your work, as you were telling us, has to do with modeling the flow of liquid and vaporized coolant in a reactor, right? And so, and the whole idea is to get a better understanding of how these systems behave in order to make reactors safer. And we were talking just a minute ago about how Iran has one civilian nuclear reactor, and they're expanding that plant. And it looks like under the agreement with Iran reached this summer, Iran will shift more of its nuclear work away from making highly enriched uranium that could have been used in weapons, and they'll be tilting toward making low enriched uranium that could only be used in reactors. So, in effect, is Iran scaling up its civilian nuclear power program, and if so, what kinds of safety issues does that raise in your mind? How well prepared, how well versed are Iranian nuclear engineers in reactor safety, and do you think that they can scale up safely?
Well, I'm not familiar with the Iranian civilian nuclear program. I know that the reactor is kind of strange. It's semi-Russian. They had originally bought the reactor from the Russians, and the Germans then finished it, or something like that. I can talk in general about the safety of the industry. Pretty much everybody uses the same nuclear reactor safety codes and the same scenarios to determine plant safety. And from a technical point of view, the problem is, I think, pretty well resolved. The big question in countries like Iran is the nuclear reactor safety culture, which is really what matters in the end. Are people really worried about nuclear reactor safety, or are they worried about something else?
Well, good point. John, do you think the IAEA stands by to help nations maintain high nuclear safety standards across? Is that part of their job, basically, to make sure that the safety culture is strongly in place?
Oh, absolutely. It's a funny thing. Nuclear got really unpopular politically in a lot of countries, and so an international organization like the IAEA became kind of the focal point for how we deal with it. It was one of the first of the international organizations which had to take leadership in a field. They have 6 departments. One of them is nuclear safety, and their job is to basically bring people together and say, okay, what are the best standards to have? And they've done a good job of doing that. Bear in mind that nuclear is a funny thing. We've had a lot of accidents. Most of the accidents took place about 30 years ago. And they were first-generation reactors. And since then, there are new generations. Now, part of the thing about that you said about the Iranian reactor is that it's an interesting combination. Probably they got the initial one from the Russians, who have a nuclear technology, and then they fixed it a little bit to make it a little bit safety. But on the whole, the new reactors that are being built, and Martin can confirm this, are on the whole much more safe. The only other accident that we know of is Fukushima, which happened when Fukuyama, when we had the tsunami, and the only problem there, I'm told, was that it was engineered to survive a 7.9 Richter scale earthquake, and they had an 8-point Richter scale thing, and as a result, they had a problem. But that was also an old reactor. And my sense of it is that the new reactors that are being built are safe, and that the agency has been one of the factors who ensures that this happens. Now, the interesting thing about the Iranians are building new nuclear reactors. The United States hasn't built one, I think, in 20 years. And so they're all old reactors. So it's an interesting thing to think about. Well, gosh, the Iranians are going to be ahead of the United States in in nuclear power. Now we can come back again of why nuclear power is going to be there, and that'll be an interesting question. I have to say, in the Paris Agreement, the word nuclear isn't mentioned once. So we have to look at that in that context, in the context of green power, other than wind, solar, tidal. And the interesting thing is that nuclear is the only one that is scalable right now. The other ones are not scalable because it requires much more investment in things like smart grids and batteries and things. Whereas nuclear, I mean, as Martin said, the technology goes back, I think, I don't remember if James Watt got the patent on it or not.
Well, so John, since you raised the Fukushima question, I want to jump to a question from an audience member, and I want to encourage audience members to send us more questions using that form right below the window. But so yeah, we have a question coming in from Catherine here in Cambridge, Mass, who asks if we this is more of a question about nuclear power in general and less about the Middle East. But she asks if we ever have another situation like Fukushima, what's the best way to address it, and where do you worry most about another accident happening? So that does relate to a bunch of questions, John, that you touched on. Most of the new nuclear reactors being built are being built in places like China, outside the United States, although there are a handful of new projects in development here in the U.S. There's an opportunity for the design and construction of a next generation plants that aren't quite so dependent on failure-prone liquid coolant systems. So perhaps, Martine, you could jump in and talk about what you think is sort of the best approach to avoiding another Fukushima. We've had lots of time to think about how to avoid another Chernobyl, another 3 Mile Island, but Fukushima is still sort of such a raw wound in Japan. What does that teach us about how to build the next generation of plants?
Well, I have a strong view about Fukushima. I think the problem at Fukushima is not the plant itself, but it's an institutional problem.
Yes.
So you want to build, safe nuclear reactors, or as safe as you can, but if you don't have a good nuclear regulatory commission that has real authority to regulate severe accidents and so forth from happening, then it's not so good. And Fukushima is a really good example of how something that we all knew that could happen happened and it was not a surprise to anybody. And it goes back to, I guess, MIT. When I went to MIT, Rasmussen was the head of the department, and I don't know if anybody remembers the Washington 1400 report. But basically, what Dr. Rasmussen said is that the nuclear reactors in the United States had a probability of having a very severe accident of 1 in 10,000 reactor years, which was basically accepted by the U.S. Congress as something that the U.S. could live with. And I think that's a very interesting number, because the accident at Fukushima was predicted. There was a report by some geologist, I think, that there had been a practically the same tsunami 1,000 years ago. So that's an accident probability of 1 in 1,000 reactor years. And yet the Japanese government failed to do anything about it. And the problem was not ignored, because it was discussed at the level of the Japanese cabinet not once but twice. And they have in Japan something called a Minister for Disasters or something like that. And I understand that in the second discussion he protested, but nothing was done. So even though we have a number, 10 to the minus 4, when people that have to actually make the decisions talk about it, they either don't understand that number or they don't know it's there. And if those people at the Japanese cabinet had been MIT graduates, they would have said, yes, we have to do something about it. And what do? Well, we do a probabilistic risk assessment, which was also invented at MIT. And then once you do a probabilistic risk assessment of that plant, you realize that you better move the diesels from the basement to the top of the hill, and the problem is solved.
You're talking about the backup generators that would have kept the coolant system flowing.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Well, so is it really that simple, though, Martine? Aren't you and your colleagues thinking about next generation reactors that would be less prone to meltdown in the case of a loss of coolant accident?
Well, yeah. If you had the the new well, there was another plant a few miles from there that had a wall that was taller, and those reactors didn't melt. And if you put the newer reactors, of course, those are already designed for station blackout accidents, and they could sustain such accidents. But the problem is, you already have all these reactors that are old and are running, and they're going to be running for many more years. What do you do about them? And there is a lot that can be done, and the way you do it is by safety culture.
Yeah, so let me jump to another audience question. This is a good moment to ask. I guess this is one I'm going to pitch to John. We have a person asking, Walter in Florida, when do you expect the implementation of the JCPOA, that's the joint agreement, the Vienna agreement with Iran, to be completed? When will implementation be completed? I guess it's actually quite a long process, right? It sets up a structure for monitoring that could go on almost forever.
Well, look, the first thing about all of this is that when we're talking about the procedure for verification, it's permanent. In other words, now the issue as far as the sanctions and other things is a process of other things that were agreed. In other words, shipping the spinning things off to wherever you're going to send them.
Centrifuges, yeah.
Centrifuges. Hey, centrifuge but then and making sure that everyone agrees that the IAEA is implementing expanded safeguards, although it won't be called that. Effectively, then you'll begin to get the agreement on the basis of which you can reduce the sanctions. Some of them have already happened. The fact that you've signed the agreement has shown that. So it's started now. You'll have certain points that are already in the agreement. When they're reached, things will happen. But the process will continue, and it'll go beyond the 15 years of the agreement, because when a state becomes party to the safeguards agreement, it basically says that forever we're going to let the agency inspect, verify that we're in compliance with our agreement. And the only countries who have not done that are the countries that either didn't ratify safeguards, and that includes India, Pakistan, and Israel, or ratified at one point and then left, which is North Korea. And so everybody else, including Iran and the United States, are in that system. And as long as the system works, that's your answer.
Okay, thanks, John. So we have a question from Will in Albany that relates to the bigger energy picture and to the international proliferation question, I guess. What do the panelists think of the U.S. development of nuclear? There are only about 5 plants in the works here. There's not much, there's not intense work going on in nuclear energy development here. How can the rest of the world think that nuclear is a worthy technology without the U.S. leading new development? So that's an interesting point. We have to have more attention to all of our energy options, and yet it would seem like the best way that the U.S. could have a role in that would be to be seriously working on our own technology, right? And yet that's not an emphasis for us right now. John?
Well, look, the first thing is that the country we should be looking at is France. France is 80% of its energy is nuclear. The other 20% is hydro. They don't burn any fossil fuels. And they've been doing this for a fair amount of time. I don't know how many of them are MIT grads who are working on it, but I happen to live in upstate New York, and the electricity that's powering my computer as we speak is either hydro from Niagara Falls or nuclear from 9 Mile whatever up by Oswego. And the interesting thing about that is one of the plants is going to close down because it's 30 years old, and they say it's too expensive to maintain. And there is an idea that somebody will build a new one. Well, the somebody is a French company owned by the French government. So one of the issues here is, well, who's got the technology to build it? Who's willing to do it? And we're in an odd world where France not only deals with the climate change thing, but builds nuclear. Now, for us to do that, I think you have to have incentives, and one of the incentives is to keep the cost of nuclear energy low by eliminating the subsidies that we have on carbon-based energy, for example. And we probably have the technology if there was a way in which we could get it economically feasible to build.
Waleed, do you want to jump in here? I know that you study the energy economy as well, to some extent, right? So, what are the prospects for international development of nuclear energy without strong U.S. leadership?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'll contribute, I mean, I'm not sure exactly, what I think of American nuclear energy, but I will say what's happened in the Middle East and the region is it's really opened the door for other countries, in particular Russia, to really play a strong role in having all these deals to build power plants across the region, from Russia to Turkey and now Egypt. I mean, the Emirates have worked with the South Korean firms, but most of all the other companies are Canadian, French, Russian. So this is one of the dimensions which the U.S. has not been playing a role in. So I'll just leave that as that's the geopolitical reading, that it's opened the door for Russia to play this strong role because it's very open and willing to be involved in these issues. Why I guess the U.S. hasn't.
Are the Russians getting better? I mean, when I think of Russia and nuclear energy, this is just me, but I think of Chernobyl, right? And that was a plant that was poorly designed and was being operated badly by the operators during the accident. But how safe is Russian nuclear technology today, I guess, is the question.
Well, after the Russians joined the European Union, they were forced to upgrade the safety to Western standards. And one of the things that they did was they had to change the fuel on all their RBMK reactors so that they would not have a positive coefficient of reactivity anymore, so that an accident like Chernobyl is ruled out. The Germans got involved very heavily, and there was a lot of money available from the European Union to upgrade or shut down the reactors in Eastern Europe. So, I think that now, at least, the Russian reactors, again, because they didn't have a culture of safety before, now they've had to try to adopt a culture of safety so that they could join the European Union. And so I think now it's a little better.
So, Martine, I'm going to actually give you the last word. Let's turn it back to the United States. So Russia has a good safety culture, France has a good safety culture, and we do too, actually. Very few accidents. So what's your diagnosis for how likely it is that nuclear power will see a resurgence here in the United States? Will we figure out what to do about nuclear waste? Will we figure out how to maybe speed up the design, development, and certification process for new plants so that we can actually get more new plants coming online, and it takes less than 20 or 30 years to do it?
Well, I think that the big problem is nuclear waste. You cannot think of a real nuclear renaissance in the United States until the problem of nuclear waste is solved. And the problem at Yucca Mountain, I think, is political. It's not really a technical problem. And again, like it was said before, look at France, or even look at WIP, which is the military nuclear waste. These are successful solutions to nuclear waste. So before anything gets done in the United States, there has to be a very, very strong signal from the U.S. leadership that they want to solve the problem of civilian nuclear waste.
Okay, well, thank you so much, gentlemen. Once again, we've run out of time faster than I thought we would, and we need to shut this down. But I'm really had a great time, and I wanted to thank each of you for joining us this morning. I also want to say on behalf of the Alumni Association and the program in Science, Technology, and Society here at MIT, thank you for tuning into this Faculty Forum Online Alumni Edition. A special thanks again to all of our MIT alumni panelists from the American University in Beirut, from Purdue, and from Cornell. There were a couple of questions that I didn't get to, so we'll send those on to our panelists and see if they can respond separately. And you can tweet about this event or other MIT Alumni Association events using the hashtag MIT alum. And you can send us follow-up questions and feedback at alumnilearn@mit.edu. I'm Wade Roush. Thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you next time here at the Faculty Forum Online on Google Hangouts. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks again for joining us. For more information on future MIT Alumni Association productions, please visit our website.